District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Congresswoman Harriet Hageman of Wyoming for a wide-ranging conversation about natural resources, energy, and much more. Congresswoman, it's so wonderful to see you. Thank you for having us in your office.
Well, thank you for coming in today.
I think it's important that my listeners learn about your background because they know about you. You're a known entity now on Capitol Hill, but you actually have a unique background in natural resources and this intersection with law. Could you please explain how you got interested in these issues?
Well, sure. Prior to coming to Congress, I was actually a trial attorney for 34 years, and most of my work centered on water, natural resources, and constitutional law. So I dealt extensively with the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, all of those different things. I worked with a variety of companies in Wyoming, as well as farmers and ranchers and municipalities. I did gravel work. I worked for oil and gas companies. Pretty much anything that kind of had an intersection with dealing with the statutes that I've already identified. Again, working on the Clean Water Act, NEPA was a big one. Also I did a lot of work in dealing with our National Forest Service lands. And BLM lands both, because Wyoming has a lot of federal lands, about 48% of our surface is state. And then from a water standpoint, I represented as irrigation districts. I worked for the state of Wyoming, and doing both contract work as well as handling Nebraska versus Wyoming. I did a ton of groundwater work in the state of Nebraska. So I've just had a pretty wide-ranging career involving what I would say is natural resources.
And that has translated to your work here on Capitol Hill, especially in the Natural Resources Committee. What has been happening? Because as we're talking, there have been several items legislatively that have moved across the line, that have not materialized. What's been on top of mind for you recently?
So one of the things that I've enjoyed about being in Congress is I'm on the Judiciary Committee and Natural Resources. So both of those committees really dovetail well with my history, my background, and my experience. And I think I'm very fortunate to be able to have that kind of experience here on Capitol Hill. In terms of the Natural Resource Committee, there's a couple of things. We've done what's called the SPEED Act, and that relates to NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, modernization. NEPA was adopted, over 50 years ago, and I think it's time for us to look at what are some of the changes that could and should be made. And so I refer to it as modernization more than reform, just because I think it is a matter of updating NEPA in light of all the technological advances that have happened over the last 50 years in terms of what we know about range management, wildlife management, water resources, hydrology, what we have in terms of tools such as computer modeling, looking at hydrology, understanding what has happened not only in the more recent memory of, say, the last 100 to 120 years, but even being able to determine what is the long-term hydrology and weather situation in Wyoming from hundreds of years ago because of computer modeling, how things have changed. And then in terms, so we passed that out of the House. The SPEED Act has passed out of the House and it's sitting in the Senate right now. Another one that we recently worked on was the modernization of the Endangered Species Recovery Act. And that is really to focus, again, on the technological advances we've had since 1972, 73, when the ESA was adopted. That one we're still negotiating, we're still working on in the House of Representatives. I'm hoping that we can get there so that we can get that passed and get it over to the Senate. But in both of these bills, really what we're looking at, some of the important things from my standpoint, is litigation reform. We all know that there is a lot of money to be made by the, what I would say are the environmental NGOs, the Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, NRDC, Earth Justice, all of these various organizations that have cropped up over the years to make money off of basically blocking projects and keeping species on the endangered species list, despite the fact that they've been fully recovered. So those are two of the really major things that we've been working on in the Natural Resource Committee, and we can talk in more detail about both of them if you'd like to.
I know, having been to Wyoming and investigating the grizzly bear situation directly, and I won an award for my coverage on that, especially in the GYE, people forget that from the outside, people may think, oh, the bear population is not recovered. It is fully recovered. It has exceeded carrying capacity. And I saw Congressman Zinke report that there have been more lethal bear-human attacks. And those are going to be especially more common if the ESA is not modernized. So speak more to that.
I would agree with that, and you're referring to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So the grizzly bear was listed as threatened in 1975, and we fully recovered them. The recovery goals were first 400 grizzly bears in the GYE, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and then they increased that to 500. By early 2000, we had we far exceeded the recovery goals of 500. We're now probably pushing 1,200 grizzly bears.
It's already 1,200
in the greater Yellowstone area. We had a horrific attack just last week. Two brothers were on a trail in Yellowstone National Park. They had just left their mother and sister. They were on a trail, a well-traveled trail, and they were attacked. The older brother was 28, very severely injured, and the 14-year-old was also injured, just not quite so badly. But some of the injuries include a terrible head injury to the back of the head. The bear probably came up behind him and hit him in the back of the head, but stripped his entire arm, all of the muscle and flesh from his elbow to his wrist on one of his arms. Broke his leg, I believe. Just a horrific attack. We've had a lot of lethal attacks in the greater Yellowstone area and outside of that, because as you pointed out, the recovery zone is actually saturated. Mm-hmm. The Fish and Wildlife Service says it's saturated, but now grizzly bears are moving well outside their historical range, because that's what happens when you saturate an area. So we're seeing grizzly bears as far away as Rock Springs. You get them in the Bighorns. I mean, you're seeing them in places we've not had them before, and it is becoming very dangerous for our hunters, our hikers, our recreationists, our bikers, all of the people that want to go in, fishermen. It's getting pretty dangerous. The Fish and Wildlife Service has moved to delist the grizzly bear 3 separate times. But there is a judge in Montana, an activist judge by the name of Malloy.
Oh, it's a different one now.
Yeah, that has consistently put them back on the list, despite the fact that we've far exceeded the recovery goals. Something else your listeners might find interesting. A lot of people think that if a species is on the list, that it's the federal government that manages them. It's the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's not the case. Even if a species is on the endangered or threatened list, it is the state game and fish departments that actually manage those species. They're the ones that monitor them. They're the ones that invest the money in them. Wyoming has spent over $50 million on grizzly bear recovery, as compared to the Fish and Wildlife Service, less than $10,000. Wow. So we're the ones who spent the money. We have 9 people in our game and fish department that are dedicated to addressing the grizzly bear. They do other things as well, but they are 9 people within game and fish. The same with the wolves. Mm-hmm. So when a species is on the list, it doesn't mean that the federal government is in charge. It just means that we have to focus more resources on that particular species. Now, in some instances, that may be appropriate, but in other instances, such as the Canadian gray wolf and the grizzly bear, being recovered by keeping them on the list, we're deflecting resources away from species that are actually in need, and spending those resources on 2 apex predators. And that brings me to another point, which is when you protect an apex predator at the expense of everything else, pretty soon you start seeing severe impacts on our other wildlife species. So after they brought the gray wolf into Wyoming, we had the northern Yellowstone elk herd was at 19,000 were the numbers. Within a few short years, they were down to 2,000. Because the gray wolves have been really devastating to both our moose and elk populations especially.
LinkedIn is great at connecting you with the world's largest professional network. But it can't connect you with motivation on a Monday morning. LinkedIn can help you get insights from your professional community. But it can't give you any insight into why Dave's still talking on mute. And while it can't stop your boss from bringing tuna for lunch, LinkedIn can help bring your career to the next level. LinkedIn is the network that works for you. Visit LinkedIn.com to learn more.
No one goes to Hank's for spreadsheets. They go for a darn good pizza. Lately, though, the shop's been quiet, so Hank decides to bring back the $1 slice. He asks Copilot in Microsoft Excel to look at his sales and costs and help him see if he can afford it. Copilot shows Hank where the money's going and which little extras make the dollar slice work. Now Hank has a line out the door. Hank makes the pizza, Copilot handles the spreadsheets. Learn more at m365copilot.com/work.
I want to ask you relatedly, I didn't send this over in topics, but as we're talking, the BLM rule from Biden's era, the so-called public lands rule, but we know that was not for multiple use, and in my estimation, it really contorted and twisted what conservation is. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on the revoking of the Biden era rule.
It's the right thing to do because the Biden era rule violated FLPMA. If you look at FLPMA and if you look at how we're supposed to be managing our BLM lands, it's very specific as to what is the goal of BLM management, if you will, or what is the purpose of our federal lands? What are the uses that are statutorily sanctioned, and I mean that are identified as uses appropriate for BLM lands, and it includes energy development, mining, oil and gas development, recreation, grazing, rights of way. Those are the types of things that we have set aside the BLM lands for. What the Biden administration did is they elevated conservation to the top of that list, despite the fact that Congress has never identified conservation as in and of itself a specific purpose for the BLM. Now, obviously, we believe in conservation, we believe in protecting our environment, but you do that in relation to the other activities. You make sure that you're mining, that you are protecting your water resources and your land resources, and you've got air quality requirements and water quality requirements, and then you have reclamation requirements after the mining operation is finished in a particular area. You have all of that. That's the conservation of what we do. Mm-hmm. But identifying conservation in and of itself as a use was a clear violation of FLPMA and previous regulations and really the way that the BLM lands have always been managed. But what it did is then it started shutting down even recreation and access to these lands. Mm-hmm. Where you really saw that in Wyoming was when they issued the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan.
Yes, related to natural asset companies.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the other part is when they attempted to push through natural asset companies in January of 2020, I guess it would be January of 2024, it was 2024, mm-hmm. They attempted to push through natural asset companies with the idea that somebody like a Bill Gates could come in and buy the, quote, natural assets of these federal lands and then dictate how these lands could be used, which was way contrary to everything that has come before, including, again, FLPMA, the Forest Service Act, the Organic Act for the creation of the National Forest Service lands. I mean, you can just go down the list of all the various things that such a proposal would violate. And so we stopped the natural asset companies from going forward. One aspect of that was very interesting was they were going to have the UN define what mm-hmm. Both in terms of the economics of the value of the property, but also to define what could be done on those lands, but no extractive industries whatsoever. But with the Rock Springs RMP, they were even shutting down recreation in areas mm-hmm. that are quite heavily used for recreation and mountain biking or off-road biking and hiking and everything else. And they were even shutting that down under the theory of conservation being the highest and best use of BLM lands.
What was disturbing to me was the conservation lease component. Because when you read the stipulation, they had an example that said, we will give, let's say, a renewable energy company carte blanche control over a conservation lease. So they can destroy a high-quality habitat with the promise that they'll restore and rehabilitate lesser quality habitat or put it to non-uses, which is against FLPMA.
Right.
And I think a lot of conservationists, I've talked to a lot of hunters, Safari Club International had said, we have questions about this and oppose this as it's written because it doesn't safeguard hunting. It allows for destruction and no uses. Mm-hmm. Is that also something you were concerned about too?
Well, I was concerned across the board because it just was such a huge, it's hard to say it's a land grab because the lands are owned by the federal government, but it was definitely a dramatic change in philosophy in terms of land management and the federal ownership and local control and local involvement in the plans for management. It was just a dramatic shift where some unelected bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. was going to change the trajectory of the United States of America with the stroke of a pen without anybody in the local communities even being involved in the discussions. It was just really, I think, epitomized the philosophy philosophy of the Biden administration, which was they're going to punish people who live in states that have a lot of federal lands. And it really would have hurt Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, even California, Montana. It would have had a huge impact west-wide.
I want to ask you about E15. And I know that's kind of caused some friction in the Republican caucus, as I had talked to some coworkers in my day job. But E15, where did you stand on it, and where is it going? Because I did see that the White House is looking, I saw they are granting a temporary waiver. The House narrowly passed a provision that is now awaiting the Senate. But what are some of your thoughts on that, or why should my listeners be concerned about E15 one way or another?
So E15 is ethanol 15, and that is allowing for the blending of 15% ethanol into gasoline. And it is something that came from the renewable fuel standards. The idea being this is one of those farm programs that never dies, even though it should. And it's the idea being that we have a lot of corn producers who've been hurting, so we need to find an alternative market to actually producing food for human and animal consumption. And so the idea behind the E15 bill was E15 is a problem in the summer and warmer months. It creates smog. So it has not been allowed to be used year-round. There were 3 or 4 months or 5 months out of the year during the summer where E15 was not allowed. And there have been waivers to allow E15 to be used throughout the year. But the big farms, the big ag states, the big farm states, and we grow some corn in Wyoming, not nearly like what you see in Nebraska or Kansas or Iowa or Ohio or places like that, Minnesota, Wisconsin. But the idea of the E15 was for Congress to say, okay, you can do E15 year-round. I'm not opposed to that. I think it's a bad policy, but I'm not opposed to it. They can do that. But the problem is that the way that they wrote the bill will essentially put small refineries out of business. So Wyoming has 4 small refineries, and by definition, under the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standards, a small refinery is one that produces 75,000 barrels or less a day. Right now, they get exemptions from having to blend. And in my case, with my refineries, they can't blend because they pipe their product. So there isn't a way to force ethanol into our process. So there's a very high risk that if this passes through the Senate, my 4 refineries are going to close because they cannot continue to produce. So what we're doing is we're using E15 year-round, and in the process with the way the bill was written, because they don't want any refinery to be exempt from producing ethanol, they're going to be shutting down our refineries. So that's why I'm mad. I'm very angry because we don't have to pick between these two. This is not a binary choice. We don't have E15 year-round or refineries. We can have both. But the way the bill was written was intentionally to make it so that small refineries are going to find it extremely difficult to keep operating.
And it's interesting kind of where people are siding on it, because I come from a fishing boating background, and a lot of my friends in the fishing industry have said that E15 is very corrosive.
It is. You can't use it in small engines like on lawnmowers, things like that, and you can't use it with your boats, with your boating equipment.
Yeah, so that's the contention they have with it, and I know that's going to be inspiring more debate about it. But no, I've always seen arguments for it, and I'm, being a free market person and an angler, I'm kind of skeptical of it being year-round. That's me personally speaking. But I have never seen such an issue that has divided a usually united, Republican caucus.
Well, and that's why it shouldn't have been brought to the floor, right? If you've got a bill that divides the caucus literally in half, then maybe you go back to the drawing table and see what you can do to bring more people to the table. So, and that is what did not happen here, and it's why I'm upset, because we could have reached a resolution that could have helped our corn growers. I want to help our farmers. I grew up on a ranch. I'm on that side. I'm not picking oil or refineries over corn. I want both of them to not only survive, but to thrive. This is not a good way of doing that. And so they had almost 100 Democrat votes. And I think that speaks volumes as well. That's the only way they could drag it across the finish line. So the situation is not good. And I'm hoping that we can do something in the Senate to block it from going forward, or at least revising it to where it's actually an E15 bill rather than a put the small refineries out of business bill, which is what it is right now.
Very well said. I want to ask you more specifically to Wyoming, but this also has national implications too. The Brook mine that is soon to be operating within the next few years. it's a very interesting project. Rare earth elements in particular have been found there. With Wyoming, being center ground for that, could you speak to how important it is to have mining?
So mining is obviously very important, and we're the largest coal producer in the nation. We're also the largest trona producer in the nation. And we are our primary competition in the trona field is, which is soda ash, baking soda, things like that. Our largest competitor there is China or Kazakhstan, but theirs is not as high a quality as ours. So this is a huge product that is mined and produced in the state of Wyoming. We have 3 rare earth sites in Wyoming so far that have been identified, one in the Ramcota facility coal mine north of Sheridan, Wyoming, one over in northeastern Wyoming, which is on Forest Service lands, and then one outside of Wheatland, Wyoming, in Sabile Canyon that is on, I believe, some state and private lands. I think all of these are exciting prospects for what we need to be doing domestically. But we not only need to be mining these materials, we also need to we need to redomesticate the processing. We used to process rare earth minerals in the United States, but we offshored it to China many years ago, and now we know the end of that story, which is that they now control so much of the world's supply because they control the processing. So it is going to take some time to rebuild, but we have the capacity and the wherewithal, and I think the finances to be able to do that. So I think all 3 of those mines are quite exciting.
I think it also is part of the greater campaign of Project Vault and some of the other efforts that the administration is doing to really reshore that back. And from a public policy standpoint, I've been following that and been very intrigued. And I think everyone agrees you need to bring it back because we don't want to be dependent on China. And then 2, with society advancing, the economy growing, you need to have that and know that it's American work, it's American might, innovation going into that, because you were right. We were the number 2 processor, I think, in the 90s, and then now we're well behind. And I think our friends and allies abroad want to work with us, and they want to move away from China, not being so dependent on that. So I think it's smart policy to look at home, and you can build a mine very sustainably and responsibly. I think people forget that, they say Republicans, they just want to build mines, no consideration to waterways, to land, to water. Yes, you absolutely can do it in concert with true conservation practices, not rewilding or preservation. I always like to make that clear. But speak to kind of the safety measures you've heard through these projects. Well,
they have to comply with all current federal statutes. So it just isn't true that we won't protect the environment as we do these. We have the Clean Water Act, we have the Clean Air Act, we have NEPA, we have the Endangered Species. When you go in, I don't know that there's a more regulated industry than our energy, mining, oil and gas. The permitting that they have to receive, not only from a federal permitting, but state and local permitting typically as well. Special use permits, for example, or it's going to be heavily regulated, probably too regulated, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just that we tend to over-regulate in this country. It's why it takes longer to open and operate a mine here. I think
29 years.
It took 29 years as compared to everywhere else on planet Earth. I think Zimbabwe is the only country that it takes a longer period of time. So, yes, we're capable of doing it. We're capable of doing it well. We have the innovation. We have technology. We have the desire. We have the workforce. We have the ability to do these things well and do them and continue to maintain our environment while also producing things that we need. After COVID, after 2020, everybody in this country, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, you should have recognized that we need to be onshoring more of the products and things that we use rather than offshoring them. Now, does that mean that we bring all manufacturing back here? Probably not. And if we were to do that, it's going to take probably decades to do it. But there are a lot of things that we do need to onshore. And I've traveled around last year with the Natural Resources Committee. We went to Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. And it was largely kind of a trade contingent where we talked a lot about our energy and how to get it to them. They want our LNG, they want our coal, they want our oil and gas. They don't want to be dependent on the Middle East. They want to have a buffer against China. Right now, they get LNG. It comes out of the port in Louisiana. It takes 41 days to get through the Panama Canal and over to those countries. If we can build a new project in Alaska, which is what the proposal is, we can get LNG from Alaska to these countries in 7 days. Wow. That's a game changer. That is a game changer for them. It shores up their supplies. It provides more certainty. It turns them more to the west rather than to the east, meaning that they are going to be stronger allies of ours where we need them, when we need them. It also disentangles them from China and the Middle East, and it strengthens our hand. And I think anytime that we can strengthen the hand of America on the world stage, it is better, not because I'm a dictator, but because we are the freest nation on planet Earth. We actually believe in human rights. We actually believe in protecting the environment. We actually believe in the things that make those countries successful.
Related to critical minerals, another industry that has kind of been behind the curve but has the potential to really rise is nuclear. Similarly, Wyoming is also playing center stage for nuclear's comeback, and uranium as well, because everyone forgets you need to have uranium, and I think, is it what we import a lot of it from Russia?
Most of it, yeah.
So but speak to the project.
Wyoming is the largest uranium producer in the nation right now. I know Texas also has a lot of uranium, but we've got a couple of different operations going. And I just had one of the folks who's very active in the uranium industry in my office just 2 days ago, and there are exciting things that are happening in Wyoming. And then we have the natrium reactor in southwestern Wyoming, the first of its kind in the country, using molten salt in the process, which makes it a very different process for creating nuclear energy than we've done in the past. So this is Bill Gates' project. He came in and he picked Kemmerer, Wyoming for the first one in the country. That's moving along very, very quickly, and I think that it's exciting. It's going to bring hundreds of jobs to southwestern Wyoming, as well as we see a lot of discussion about the micro reactors or basically the portable generators almost that run on nuclear energy. Because as we're talking, nuclear energy, it's getting more acceptance, I would say, amongst the American public. Women, for the first time in my understanding, are now supporting nuclear. British women do not like nuclear whatsoever. But I think nuclear is starting to become more universally appealing and well-liked because it's clean, actually clean, zero emissions, very small land footprint. People do not talk about how amazing the density is of that. But speak more to the benefits and why you think states like Wyoming will attract more nuclear projects. Well, the word density is one that I use when we talk about energy because it's very important to understand you have to look at the unit of land necessary per unit of energy produced. And when you look at wind and solar, they're very not dense. They're very diffuse. And as a result, the cost, the amount of land that is necessary to produce the same amount of energy as one pumper for oil. And a lot of times when we talk about wind and solar and they talk about the cost of them, they never take into consideration the land mass that is necessary to produce what they're producing. I was down in Colorado Springs a year or so ago, and we were standing on the top of a coal-fired power plant. And I looked across Interstate 25 and saw on the east side over there a huge solar field. And the differences in the footprint, the coal-fired power plant was 300 acres, solar was 3,000. The coal-fired power plant operates 24/7 and produces more than the solar does. The cost differential was just astronomical. And the way that I always talk about solar is that for 8 to 10 hours a day, you have a catastrophic failure every single day because the sun goes down. So that's the other important part about nuclear is that it's a very dense form of energy. It does not have the kind of footprint that you have with some of these other kinds of projects. So it is something that I didn't know all the information that you just provided about women becoming more amenable to the idea of nuclear energy. But here's what I'm going to say. We're using more energy today than we used yesterday, and we're going to use more energy tomorrow than we're using today. This only ratchets up from here. We're never ratcheting backwards.
Correct.
Not in light of data centers, AI. Just look around this room right here. I've got 4 computers, 6 computers, 8 computers sitting here. Right here, I've got the computer on my desk. I've got 2 phones. You've got a phone. Tristan here has 2 phones, and I've got a TV. And every single one of those are computers, the likes of which 30 years ago we never could have even imagined existed. And people are not giving those up. So we have to have reliable and affordable energy. It's absolutely imperative to the future of our country. It is a national security issue, but it's also a quality of life and a prosperity issue. And so we have to continuously be innovative as to how how we're going to meet those demands. And we cannot always be naysayers and doomsdayers. We need to be optimistic. We need to recognize that technology makes a difference, that our technological advances have brought us to this moment in time. And we need to be careful. We need to be thoughtful. We don't want, 70 data centers around a municipality. But we do really need to be thoughtful about this, but we need to recognize that the energy is the critical differential between a prosperous country and a poor one.